Welcome to Annaberg. My name is Paula and I'm a volunteer for the Friends of the Park, and I will tell you about the history of Annaberg and also how it relates to the history of St. John. Tell you a little bit about growing sugar, making sugar, and everything that went on in this area for the last few hundred years. The history of Annaberg actually begins around 1721 when the first people came to start an estate on this property at Annaberg. It was much smaller plantation at that time, and it was a Dane by the name of Constantine who first came here to start growing sugar cane. Denmark owned these islands in the 1700s. They actually owned them up until 1917, and they were very late coming to the Caribbean. Most of the islands already, in fact all of the islands already, were owned by other European countries who were becoming very rich growing sugar, and Denmark finally decided quite late in the time period that they wanted also to be involved in this area, and so they purchased St. Thomas in the late 1600s. St. John at that time had just a few people living here with subsistence kind of farming, and it wasn't until things got going really well on St. Thomas and people who were living over there decided that it was time to expand their plantations, and they looked to St. John, which was about the only island left that was not already growing sugar on it, and they were able to purchase it then and begin production. They came in 1721, and it took, at this site, it took 10 years to clear the hills and to get the first crop brought in. So when you look around here, what you see now is nothing like it looked in 1721. At that time, there was a forest here, but it was a hardwood forest, so it was very park-like in appearance, because the kind of trees that grew here, such as tropical hardwoods like mahogany or bay rum trees, these don't have an understory. So there was a park-like look. People could walk through much more easily than you can today. The things that you see here today are the second or third growth after sugar, the sugar era. So what they did was they came in and they cut down all the trees. It took about 10 years to cut most of the trees so that they could start growing sugar. One of the things I want to mention about the Danes coming here is that even though the Danes owned St. John, very few Danes ever lived here. They were very late coming, as I mentioned, and they didn't have much interest in it. They didn't have a lot of experience. And so what they tended to do was own the property but hire Dutch overseers to take care of their plantations. The Dutch had a long history in the Caribbean, and they were very good at growing sugar and at controlling African slaves. And without slave labor, of course, you could not possibly grow sugar in a place like this. And so the Danes owned the land. The Dutch were the overseers, and the labor force was African slave and slave labor. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that people here spoke English, and that just seems kind of crazy. If the Danes owned it, the Dutch were the overseers, and the Africans, of course, spoke many different languages. Why did they speak English here? And the reason they spoke English is that, of course, the British Virgin Islands already were speaking English, so, and many of the people who were coming over to St. John had come from Tortola. Also, the Moravians were the people, the Moravian Church were here, and they were running the schools, and they were teaching, by law, Danish children had to learn how to read and write, whether they were slave children or free children. And so the Moravian Church set up schools in the territory, and they taught in English, because English was the language of trade. English was the language that was spoken in the British Virgin Islands, and it just was easier to teach everyone to speak English. So it was kind of a real mishmash here, and unusual setup. So we talked about Mr. Constantine coming here in 1721, and he started the first plantation on this site. He's important, but there's two other people who are the most important, and we'll talk more about them. The first one was James Murphy. James Murphy, who was a slaver who lived over on St. Thomas, who owned slave ships, and he owned a plantation over there. And he's the one who was the most important man, actually, for this plantation in its history, and one of the most important for the island. And the second most important person is a man named Carl Francis. And Carl Francis, many of the buildings that you see here were restored or date from Carl Francis's time. The name Annaberg means Anna's Hill, and a man in 1758 owned this property, and his name was Solomon Zeger, and he named it for his wife Anna. But during the time from 1721 until about 1796, there were a bunch of different owners, and it was a moderately successful plantation. And then came James Murphy. James Murphy, as I mentioned, lived over in St. Thomas. He was an Irishman who lived on St. Thomas. He had 2 daughters and a wife, and he came over to St. John to expand his holdings. He purchased Annaberg, and at the same time he purchased 5 other plantations that were contiguous with Annaberg, called the whole thing Annaberg. And during his lifetime, Annaberg was the largest, the most successful, the most important, and the most modern plantation on St. John. St. John was a very poor island. Just as an example, St. Croix, which was the other island that the Danes purchased, St. Croix had 140 windmills. Windmills are very expensive to build, but with windmills you can produce so much more sugar, you can process so much more cane. On St. John, we had only 5 windmills. All 5, by the way, are still in existence, and you can walk around. Some of them are on private property, 3 of them are on park property, and they're interesting to see. We're going to look at one of them in depth when we get up a little bit further along. So Mr. Murphy came in 1796, and he purchased this land, and he immediately set out to improve it and to make it really special. During his heyday, he produced approximately 100,000 pounds of sugar in a year out of this one plantation. And just as an example, by the end of the era, when sugar plantations were all ending, and there were only 5,000 pounds of sugar being produced, and that was in the 1860s. So it just gives you an idea of how quickly it came and went. Its heyday came and went. He had 666 slaves living on this one plantation. And we're standing right here where the slave quarters were. We know of 65 separate slave houses, slave dwellings. In the beginning, they were just made out of mud and sticks, wattle and daub construction. Eventually, they were much more like real homes, and you can see right here the foundations, the little bits that are left of the slave area, the slave village. So this was like a real village. People lived in family units, and they fished down below in the water. There were fruit trees that were planted here. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is right behind us, there's a large hill. That's called Ajax Peak. And Ajax Peak is at the very, very top of Ajax Peak. The slaves were allowed to have small plots of land that they grew their vegetables on. So you might wonder, why did they grow their fruits and vegetables all the way up there? What was the reason that that piece of land in particular was given to the slaves to grow their food? And the answer is that that land was too poor to grow sugar cane. So the slaves were allowed that area. They worked, by the way, from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week from the age of 5. And on Sundays, they were allowed, or after work or before work, they were allowed to go up and take care of their little plots of land. The reason that they had these little plots of land is, number one, was for food, because they were really never fed enough, considering the kind of work they had to do and the conditions they were working under, to be very healthy. So that enabled them to grow more food to stay healthy. It also enabled them to have possibly a surplus of food, something that they could maybe sell on the market and get a little bit of money, and little by little they could perhaps put away enough money to purchase their freedom. This plantation was a little bit more enlightened than some of the others and treated their slaves in a slightly better fashion than many of them did. But another thing that's interesting about Ajax Peak is that back in the 1700s, in 1733, there was a slave uprising on St. John, and St. John's slave uprising was the only successful slave uprising in the Caribbean. And for a 6-month period, the slaves of St. John held the island. They killed 25% of the whites who were here. And although on this particular plantation nobody was killed, but when it was put down, when the uprising was finally put down after 6 months, there were 2 significant things about this location. Number one is right there, Mary's Point. Mary's Point is the place where those slaves who were about to be captured at the very end of the uprising chose to jump to their deaths rather than be captured. If they were captured, they would be drawn and quartered, and rather than have that happen, they jumped with their families to their deaths on the other side of Mary's Point. Getting back to Ajax Peak, the reason that's kind of interesting is that after the uprising, all over St. John, the owners of the plantations were nervous about the slaves getting together and perhaps rising again. And that land at the top of our of Ajax Peak, that little bit of land that the slaves from this plantation were using for their gardens, just on the other side of that was the boundary of the nearby plantation. And that's exactly where their slaves were allowed to have their little plots at the top of the hill on the other side of the hill. And so in order to keep the slaves from this plantation from speaking to the slaves from the other plantation and perhaps getting together again and causing problems, a slave named Ajax sat up there on a chair and watched to make sure that people from this plantation didn't get to know the people from the other plantation. So to this day, that is called Ajax Peak, after that particular slave Ajax. Now, all around you, as you would have seen sugarcane being grown. And we'll get back to growing sugarcane after I finish explaining a little bit more about history. Mr. Murphy, as I mentioned, he built the windmill. He made this the most successful, the biggest, the state-of-the-art sugar plantation on St. John. And that went along for quite a while until Mr. Murphy died actually in 1809, and then his children inherited the plantation. But then a few things started to happen that affected the history of this plantation and all plantations in St. John. The first thing is that in 1833, slavery ended over on Tortola. How did that affect St. John? Only in that slaves on this plantation knew if they could swim to safety to Tortola, they could be free. So for the first time, they began to have a real problem with slaves trying to escape, and many did. In 1848, slavery ended on St. John. Without slaves, it is virtually impossible to grow sugarcane on these islands, just looking at these hills. We don't have water, we don't have an underground aquifer, we don't have rivers and streams except at certain times of the year. So it's hard to grow sugarcane even under the best of circumstances. You have poor soil, you had one crop that wasn't rotated, so you had year after year the same crop being produced, so the soil became depleted. You had, although the fields were terraced to try to hold the water, still the water was washing away the topsoil. 1848, slavery ended, so that was tough. And then the sugar beet was developed. The sugar beet can be grown in temperate climates. Sugar cane needs subtropical climates. So there's a very narrow band around the earth that you can grow sugar cane. But you can grow sugar beets in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, in South America, in nice big flat fields using a horse to plow. So it's much, much cheaper to grow sugar cane. The product is virtually indistinguishable. And it also is fully grown in 6 months. It takes 18 months to grow sugar cane. You've got to do it by hand. You've got to plant the little ratoons. They're about 18 inches tall. You've got to plant each ratoon by hand. You've got to water it in by hand. You've got to fertilize it. You've just got to take care of it. You've got to cut it all down by hand. And you've got to do all this while climbing in this heat up and down these hills. Sugar beets have it all over sugarcane. So those were some of the things that happened to make sugarcane not quite as good a crop as it was in the past. And then in 1867, there were 2 earthquakes and a hurricane. And one of those earthquakes was so severe that there was a tsunami in Charlotte Amalia Harbor where people died because they went down into the water. When they saw the water all emptying out of the harbor, they went down to the harbor, saw ships lying on their sides and fish flopping around. They all rushed down into the harbor, and of course, we all know what happens in a tsunami. The water came rushing back in, pushed the ships, a lot of the ships, right up into the hills and killed many of the people. On St. John, what happened is many of the buildings collapsed, including the buildings right here on St. John. Now, one of the people who was living on the plantation at that time was a man named George Francis. George Francis was born a slave on this plantation, but by the time slavery was over, he was now living on this plantation as a foreman. He was kind of helping to run things. And when the owners of Annaberg could no longer afford to pay people, they could no longer afford to run the plantation after those hurricanes and earthquakes, after they were no longer producing much sugar. Remember, by then it was down to 5,000 pounds instead of 100,000 pounds. Finally, the owners just sold it to the owner at that time, which was no longer the Murphy family, but several other owners had come and gone by then. That owner sold it to Mr. Francis. And George Francis owned Annaberg, a place that he had been born a slave on. And he ran it for a few years. He tried to have sugar here. He tried a few other crops. Wasn't successful, and eventually he left too. And not much happened here until 1899, when George Francis' son, Carl Francis, came back to St. John. He'd been away, and he purchased Annaberg. Purchased it for very little money, and when he came here, he found most of it in ruins. The buildings had collapsed, partially because of the earthquake, and also partially because one of the things that really always amazes me is when you go into town here and you see Mongoose Junction, or you see some of the homes that are built here, they're in this beautiful Danish architecture. Everybody wants their houses to look, and shopping centers to look like the old Danish architecture. What they don't realize is that in Danish times, it didn't look like this at all. What you are seeing is what was the underneath that nobody was ever expected to see. When they built these buildings, what they used for mortar, they made themselves by mixing sand, molasses, and crushed burned shells. They mixed that together, and they made mortar.